Hello. So I've just watched the Shapiro interview for like the fifth time. But I didn't really react to it because I was that busy. Of course, you could argue that the politically incorrect phrases that he made against Jews that voted for Obama or Obama himself or Trump or Palestinians or so-called Arabs, that they were taken out of context to smear his image. But you could also factor in the belief that Mr. Shapiro has admitted himself that he has made some, silly errors in judgment by making silly comments about certain types of people. And you could tell that, yes, the phrases that Mr. Andrew Neil took were taken out of context. The phrases that Mr. Neil used against Shapiro, things that Shapiro used to say, were taken out of context. But even if you put the context back in, and then Mr. Shapiro, excuses himself and defends himself as to why he said what he said about Palestinians, saying, oh, well, they voted for Hamas. They go and teach kids that Israel should be obliterated. That when he talked about Jews that voted for Obama aren't really Jews, that most of the Jews that would have voted for Obama would have been the Jews that are only Jews in terms of ethnicity and not in terms of religion. Now, again, you have to think about the fact that no matter who you are as a person, anything you say, anything you believe will have some sort of bias, especially with some emotional connection to it. Like, you can say anything you want, but you have to admit that people say things emotionally and then they try and justify it logically, just like people buy emotionally and then justify it logically. So it's like, let's say me, for instance, if somebody who happens to be Caucasian says something derogatory about me as a person, I could take it that they're just being derogatory towards me as a person, or depending on what they say, whether they're disrespecting, the way what I look like or the way I talk or something. Depending on what they say, I could presume or assume that there's a racial undertone or racist undertone to what that person's saying. For example, if somebody who happened to be white or Caucasian said that I sound posh for a black person, I could say, well, microaggression, racism, he thinks that all black people are supposed to sound uncultured. Or I could understand that he hasn't been introduced to many black people, and the ones that he does know, most of whom speak differently from me. Not everything has to be racist. So it's like that. If that was taken out of context by somebody who happens to be white or Caucasian, that could be seen as racist out of context. But within the context, it may not be racist. That may have been what happened with Mr. Ben Shapiro. A bunch of stuff he used to say back in 2012, according to him, that was repeated in 2019 by Mr. Andrew Neil on behalf of the BBC, which I almost agree has tilted to the left a little bit. But then again, when it comes to people like Corbyn and Diane Abbott, it's tilted to the right a little bit. Like when Corbyn has his little protests, it turns out they're not little protests. Tens and thousands of people come. But the BBC, if they report these protests at all, they show the camera angle so that it looks like only a few hundred people came. That's that I need to say. Also, to summarize, because we're already 3.5 minutes in, I just want to say that to understand people individually, you have to understand them as people, and you have to understand what you stand for. If you want to know more about Ben Shapiro, read his books. He's got a YouTube channel. He's worked for different companies. He does his own thing. Go and listen to what he's been talking about if you want to know, instead of just believing what the BBC wants to tell you about people. Because you may look at Ben Shapiro and you may think, oh, well, I don't like Ben Shapiro. He's this, he's that. He doesn't like women. He's pro-life. He doesn't care about women's rights and women's bodies. Oh, he's transphobic, homophobic, anti-Semitic, anti-Muslim, blah, 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 blah. You could say that, but what if it's you? What if you out here thinking and doing and saying what you believe is right, and somebody comes at you with some out of context nonsense that you wrote on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram 5 years ago, and you weren't prepared for it? And then you have to go excusing yourself and defending yourself as to what you may have said 5 years ago, instead of just trying to have a debate about these issues, which in this case, when it came to Shapiro and Neil, they were talking about the fact that Georgia had made abortion illegal. but they were talking about, oh, Palestinians, Hamas, Jews. Like, what the... come on. Come on. Is that... Mr. Neil, you can do better than that. And then for him to say, oh, I'm a journalist, I'm an unbiased journalist. If you were pro-abortion, I would give you anti-abortion questions. But then at the same time, is that because you're doing it or because the BBC wants you to do it? Now I will take the benefit of the doubt and presume or assume that Mr. Andrew Neil, a seasoned journalist, is doing this out of his own accord, and he's doing it because he wanted to ask those specific questions and not because the BBC wanted him to ask those specific questions. I presume or assume that Mr. Andrew Neil has his own autonomy, has his own mind, has his own brain. And I will assume or presume the same about Mr. Ben Shapiro. Now, on that note, gotta go. Gotta hustle. Speak soon. Goodbye. It's Hugh from Politically Challenged. See you next time.